So it seems that we get a proper look at the Kroot rules today with an absolutely enormous rules drop on Games Workshop's battle report. Seems the Kroot detachment gives you army-wide invulnerable saves and a handy damage buff. Krootox Rampagers hit with a pretty scary amount of AP1 attacks on the charge. There's stratagems for hiding units and returning things from the dead. And staple picks like the Kroot Carnivores and Krootox Rider have got some interesting glow-ups. Let's take a look at what we've got. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Kroot, and in this video I thought we'd do a full roundup on all the new rules reveals from Games Workshop's battle report for the army. Teased over on Warhammer Plus, and it did actually show off a fair few interesting stat lines, enhancements and stratagems for all the stuff they're going to be getting in the Tau Codex this week. I thought the battle report was a fairly fun watch. It was Kroot versus Carachan. I'll not talk too much about the outcome, seeing as some people might want to watch it, though I did maybe feel that Infantry Heavy Guard might have been a slightly conspicuous choice for something that the Kroot units are going to have good damage against. With most of their weapon profiles, they are pretty well set up to destroy light infantry. At least for demonstrating the abilities of a new faction, Guard do seem like pretty ideal punching bags with that way. Their reinforcements resurrecting chaff squads from the dead, only to get attacked again in turn. I can't help but think that the damage profiles of the Kroot would have looked a lot more underwhelming in, to say something, with a bunch of 2+ armor saves like Space Marine Terminators and things. In any case though, there were a fair few interesting interactions and moments. Would recommend giving it a watch if you've got the sub. For the army list that was being played, it's basically the Kroot Hunting Pack box set out of the Kroot launch box that's coming this weekend. So we basically got a whole bunch of previews on the War Shaper, Flesh Shaper, Kroot Carnivores, Rampagers and Krootox Rider mainly, but also really quite a lot of good stuff about their new detachment that's coming in Codex Tau Empire, with all the stratagems and unit support being geared around the Kroot squads. We've got most of the rules for the detachment, though not all of them. The core rules, 2 enhancements and 3 stratagems, is about half of the content. I guess we'll talk about that a bit more when they preview more stuff later in the week, but between that and a whole bunch of unit profiles and stat lines, there's a far better idea as to what these new Kroot can do. Let's go through the rules then. We'll start with the Kroot detachment rules, then go through each of the units in turn and round up any other Kroot teasers that Games Workshop have given us so far. I must admit the Kroot Hunting Pack rules do look kind of fun. All the stuff that they've showcased is pretty effective looking so far. I feel like it maybe was a detachment that they did need to give a fair bit of core rule support to try and make the Kroot stand on their own as an army of some sort. Even with these stat lines that we've seen, I feel like they're really going to struggle against certain targets, particularly tough stuff with high saves. For that reason though, if you've got all of your stuff locked to units that are maybe only sort of mid-tier damage dealers, it does mean that you can give them some stronger stuff, and Games Workshop does seem to have here. It appears that the Kroot detachment gets 2 core special rules, Hunter's Instincts and Skirmish Fighters. At the moment I'm a little unsure as to whether or not one of those might actually be a faction rule for the Kroot, given that they can't benefit from the core Tau Greater Good rule. It really would be kind of fun if Games Workshop gave them an offering if you field an army of nothing but Kroot to give you an advantage there. In any case, the 2 rules that they were having on the battle report were Hunter's Instincts and Skirmish Fighters. Hunter's Instincts is a damage buff. This one means that each time a Kroot model attacks a unit that's below starting strength, you add 1 to the hit roll, and if it's below half strength, it's +1 to the wound roll as well. I feel like that's a pretty useful damage buff that will definitely come up in game. I think that's far more useful than the rules that you get damage boosts as your own units take casualties. It means that you could potentially have 4 units of Kroot getting +1 to hit and +1 to wound on occasion. Though I feel like the main focus of that buff is usually going to be the +1 to hit. That's just really quite easy to trigger. You could potentially use a little bit of chip fire to injure an enemy unit, and then go in with your mainline damage dealers after. Maybe chip a few wounds with some Kroot rifles to line up a more devastating charge for some Krootox Rampagers later in the turn. With the below starting strength rules, it does mean that it wouldn't be quite as effective on big multi-model, multi-wound units. If it's a single model unit or if it's a single wound unit, then killing any one model or taking any one wound would be able to trigger that buff. If you say we're fighting a squad of Terminators and you did 2 wounds to them, that wouldn't actually count as below starting strength. You'd actually need to kill an entire model. Either way though, it does seem like a pretty helpful damage dealing rule for the Kroot that will certainly come into effect. I'd treat the +1 to wound as a bit of a nice to have when it triggers. Certainly powerful, but maybe just feels like you're doubling down on killing something that you were already fairly effectively killing already. The other rule that they had active is called Skirmish Fighters. It gives them a 5+ invulnerable save at range and a 6+ in melee. This one's a pretty solid durability increase, certainly makes them far less easy just to insta-kill at range as you often could with the Kroot Carnivores at the moment. Even with their stealth rule, the Kroot Carnivores were just kind of horrifically squishy with their low saves. Getting a 5+ invulnerable and a -1 to hit does mean that they're not going to get trivially taken out by just a small flurry of small arms fire, even if they likely are going to lose some casualties each time they get attacked. Definitely nice for some of their Krootox bigger models as well, with a 5+ invulnerable save against some intense damage. And overall, that does seem like a nice power boost to the army if you're playing around with the Kroot detachment, and the Tau Empire aren't getting much. I must admit, these rules do look pretty cool, to be honest. I feel like they're actually meaningful and impactful and what you want on the Kroot army, and I feel like getting some fairly direct buffs like this is pretty sensible, given that you're not giving support to other Tau units. Beyond that, we've got 2 enhancements shown off. It had one on the Warshaper and one on the Flesh Shaper. The Warshaper one was called Root Carved Weapons. It gives all weapons precision and devastating wounds for him. At the moment, we've only been shown off one of his 2 stat lines, which is the Dart Bow and Tri-Blade one. Devastating wounds does seem like it's pretty relevant on the Dart Bow one though, given that that one has anti-infantry 3+, so it means that any wound on a 3+ against an infantry unit does a devastating wound, which if it keeps on firing for multiple turns, as it did in that battle report, you would inflict some good chip damage over time. It does kind of rely on the Warshaper being left alive for a few rounds worth of shooting though, which isn't guaranteed. I feel like this one could be interesting enough if it's really quite cheap, though it's probably not going to massively change the way that you use the unit. Otherwise, the other enhancement that they mentioned but we didn't really see in the battle report is the Borthrog Land. This one's one for a Flesh Shaper only, and while the bearer is leading a unit, each time a model in that unit makes an attack, an unmodified hit roll of a 5+ scores a critical hit. Unfortunately, I don't think we saw the squad attack, so we don't know what the critical hit benefit will be, but it wouldn't make sense to have a boosted critical hit roll without getting either sustained or lethal hits. My guess is, though, that the Flesh Shaper will grant lethal hits to his unit, and again, if this one's cheap enough, then that'd be auto-wounding the enemy on a 5+ with a Kroot unit, definitely allowing you to stack some big saves. I feel like it's genuinely quite good if he's lethal hit, maybe a bit more passable if it's sustained. It would be good to know that they could reliably do at least some damage to each enemy unit, even if realistically they're still not going to be standout if they're AP0, which the standard Kroot Carnivores attacks still are. Otherwise, beyond the enhancements, we've got some stratagems. There's a particularly good one in Hidden Hunters, 1 command point for any Kroot unit that was targeted as a shooting attack to not be shot this turn if it's greater than 12 inches away. As ever, this one is an absolutely great one if you have it in your detachment. Just hide a unit from enemy gun lines and you don't know what's going to be hidden until they're halfway through their shooting phase sometimes. Sometimes you could also allow your opponent to do some chip damage to one unit and then hide it if they go after it with anything more serious. For 1 command point, this seems like a pretty great one to have to hand. Really nice for units that are trying to take objectives, meaning that you just know they can't get gunned down by anything that's far away, and could be pretty scary on any meaningful damage dealers. It does look like the Krootox Rampagers might be one of the best targets for that. Means that you could just have a fairly threatening, scary melee unit right out in the open, and the enemy can't do a thing about them until they get close, which isn't really where they want to be to them. Overall, this one's a massive increase in strength for the detachment. Next up, and a bit more situationally, is Grisly Feast. It looks like this one might have been reinterpreted from the Kroot Carnivore special rule for their unit. They've got an objective securing special rule now, but basically this one still triggers when you slay an enemy unit in the fight phase. When you've done that, if you trigger this in that fight phase, then in the enemy's next command phase, any units within 6 inches of that Kroot unit that did the slaying will need to test Battle Shock, and will do so on a -1 if they're below half strength. As Battle Shock rules go, I feel like this one is not useless. It would be useless if you were testing in that same fight phase, but given that it's in the command phase, it makes a lot more sense. I guess this will be a bit of a Hail Mary attempt to stop the opponent scoring some victory points and claiming an objective if it was close. Could well be worth throwing a command point at if it is literally going to swing like 5 victory points or something like that, though still we do have the chance of the opponent just passing it. I feel like that one's going to be kind of rarely used as a result. Kind of needs to be in the right situation and also have killed something nearby the objective and the potential failed test be meaningful. It will come up from time to time, though I'd say not every game, and even then it's a bit risky. Thirdly though, it seems that Kroot get reinforcements. Join the Hunt allows you some respawning units. This one looks like it's basically an equivalent of the Imperial Guard or Tyrannid Unending Swarm one. For 2 CP, you can use this in any phase when Kroot Infantry or Kroot Hounds are destroyed. You can use this stratagem, and then you're allowed to put that unit back into Strategic Reserve, counting as a new copy of the same unit. Though if it was destroyed with attached characters attached, then those attached characters can't come back. Generally, spending command points for extra models to return to the board is rarely a particularly bad idea. I guess the big value ones would be Kroot Carnivores or Farstalkers potentially. I guess maybe if Kroot Carnivores could turn up to threaten the enemy backfield in the late game, that could be kind of fun. At the moment, we don't know whether or not Games Workshop will keep them with their squad size of 20 as an option, or they'll just be 10. If you could resurrect a full squad of 20 of them, then that could be 100 or so points returned to the fight, at least giving your opponent a bunch more stealthy and invulnerable save bodies to chew through. I do notice it's a battle tactic as well, which could be interesting with the Kroot Warshaper. He gets 3 battle tactic stratagems in a similar sort of way to captains, though to my understanding I feel like you wouldn't be able to use that with this given that the unit was just destroyed, so he wouldn't actually be on the table at that point to use that ability. My guess would be that you probably can't use that if a Kroot squad with a Warshaper attached is destroyed, though please let me know if I'm mistaken down in the comments. In any case, I think it's looking really good for the detachment so far. The enhancements look usable if they're cheap enough. Hidden Hunters and Respawning Kroot are both great, and both of the detachment buff style rules look really quite useful. Overall looks pretty fun so far. Getting onto the units though, and let's start out with those exciting Krootox Rampagers. And these guys were perhaps the unit that I was most keen to see some stats for. It turns out that these guys do get scouts, means that they could be getting some fairly easy early game charges. I don't think they confirmed exactly how far the scout move was, but a lot of them get 7 inches. I would guess it would probably be that. Their stat line is toughness 6 and 3 wounds, I believe. I couldn't quite see the amount of wounds remaining for one that got injured, but at 8 damage to attack without dying. I guess they're probably going to have super low saves similar to the previous Krootox. It'll either be a 6+ or a 5. For their weapons though, they do genuinely pack a punch. They get 2 shots each from their pistols and hunting lances. Again, not quite confirmed on the strength there. They were either strength 4 or strength 5 and 1 damage, so a little flurry of pistol shots that could be handy for trying to trigger Hunter's instincts before charging in. Though of course it's melee where they really get to work. Hunting blades from the Riders get you 3 attacks hitting on a 3+ at strength 4 AP 1, damage 1 with the Lance keyword, so they are actually kind of meaningful to stack a few saves there. And then on top of that you get the Krootox Rampager Fists, 4 attacks hitting on a 3+ at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2 with sustained hits 1. A fairly nice middle sort of profile there that'll be good against sort of medium infantry, though again will struggle to punch up against anything enormously tougher. To help out against tough stuff though, they do get the Kroot Linebreaker special rule. The special rule for the unit appears to be that you get mortal wound impact hits for each model in engagement range where they're made a charge, D3 mortal wounds each on a 4+. If they happen to kill something, then the enemy takes a battle shock test. Sometimes that's a bit more meaningful than others. In the fight phase, I guess it could counteract some defensive stratagems, or occasionally be relevant for certain end of turn secondaries. Overall though, first impressions are this unit definitely looks interesting and usable, points cost depending of course. Against any sort of Space Marine or lesser foe they're going to be absolutely brutal. They've got enough mid-strength and volume attacks plus their mortal wound thing to at least worry heavier things like enemy battle tanks. Throwing so many dice at the enemy, you are likely to get some results there. Overall I think they're kind of fun. I feel like they'll be one of the more interesting Kroot units, though they still don't really have quite enough, I think, to be dedicated anti-tank for the sub-faction. Again, I do think that that's going to be a weakness. Fairly scary to think, though, that Tau Empire could include a unit of these as some pretty potent countercharge. The enemy might be a little bit more wary of just rushing Tau Empire lines if there's a unit or 2 of these lurking somewhere out of line of sight and ready to do a charge. Just having a little bit of counter-charge melee can be really quite impactful. It looks like these guys could easily provide that with that sheer amount of volume attack. Otherwise, we got some fun clarifications on their characters. The Warshaper is basically confirmed to be the captain equivalent for the Kroot army. I was wondering whether it would be a damage buff or free stratagems. It seems that this War Leader rule gets you free stratagems, so a battle tactic stratagem for 0 CP each battle round. They were using it on command point rerolls in this one. I don't know if the Kroot detachment's got any other battle tactic stratagems aside from the reinforcement style one. I guess we'll wait and see there. Otherwise, he's somewhat helpful on objectives, a once per game pass battle shock rule for a single Kroot unit within 12 inches of the model. That's genuinely handy enough to have around in the middle of the battle line. Flipping something to be on battle shocked compared with when it was could be big, though I think that you wouldn't be able to use it on standard battle shocks for objectives within the same turn, given that it has to be used at the start of the phase, and in the command phase you test battle shock, then you score objectives at the end of the command phase, so it might just be a bit more relevant for more contesting enemy objectives in their turn compared with taking objectives in yours. Otherwise, we don't know about the Bladestave and Preyhook loadout that he'll have, which is the one pictured. That'll be a bit more close combat related, I think. The one that was shown off was the more ranged loadout, the Dart Bow and Tri-Blade. They look like they've got a combined shooting profile of D6 shots at ballistic skill 4+, and anti-infantry 3+. I'd guess it might be AP1. We don't know the AP on it because they were using that devastating wounds enhancement, which did add up to a bit of chip damage across a bunch of infantry over the game. In close combat with that loadout, his 4 attacks at weapon skill 2+, strength 5, AP 0 and damage 1. Adds a tiny bit of close combat to the units, though not really much. That's definitely the ranged loadout. I feel like his value might depend on whether there's other good battle tactic stratagems within that detachment. If not, then he's probably not going to be worth it just for command point rerolls unless he's ridiculously cheap. Otherwise, we've got the Flesh Shaper. He looks like he's a different sort of Kroot support leader. I believe he was 3 wounds, as that was mentioned when he took some damage from Slime Marbo in the battle report, though it's maybe a little bit unclear. He was taken out fairly early, so we didn't get quite as much look at his stats. It was mentioned that he gets a scattergun, which I guess is the gun slung over his back. It looks like he can do at least some melee things with those butchering blades that he's got to hand. Otherwise, he comes with 2 different special leadership type rules. Rites of Feasting gives you a 6+ feel no pain type save for the unit, increasing to a 5+ if the unit destroys something in the fight phase. So I guess that's the new reinterpretation of the Kroot Carnivore core rule from the previous index. I think that's alright, but it's not hugely meaningful. A 6+ feel no pain type save on 1 wound infantry is only so-so. Otherwise, I'm kind of more interested in the Ritual Butchery special rule, which as mentioned didn't get revealed. My guess is that it's lethal hits though, and as mentioned, if so, that would make him a fairly good damage and defensive sort of unit just to make a Kroot squad a bit more threatening, perhaps particularly with that enhancement if it does turn out to be lethal hits. Again though, I feel like he'd have to be kind of cheap. You are trying to make a unit into a damage and defensive type unit that's generally a lot more of a cheap sort of skirmish squad. Talking of Kroot Carnivores, they have got a few rules changes that we saw. I'd guess the vast majority of their stat line should be largely kind of similar. Strength 4 rifles with AP 0. They do remain 2 attacks at weapon skill 3+, strength 4 and AP 0 in close combat. And while they're not battle line at Index Town at the moment, I'd also guess they'd probably pick up the battle line keyword for the Kroot detachment. It would be kind of weird if they didn't, given that they're certainly the Kroot foot troops. For the game rules, it was confirmed that they still get stealth and scouts, so -1 to hit, and their pre-game 7-inch move. And while the squad was really quite simplistic before, with literally every Kroot having the same stat line, then now it looks like there's a couple of extra model special rules within the unit. A Tangle Bomb launcher is a blast weapon with D3 shots, hitting on a 4, strength 5, AP 0, and damage 1. It's only a little bit better than the standard Kroot rifle really, I think, but worth having and might chip off an extra wound or so against hordes, I suppose. The leader is apparently called a Long Quill, and he gets a Kroot carbine of some sort. Not 100% sure if its stats really differ in any big way compared with the standard rifles. Otherwise though, they've had their special rule changed as mentioned earlier. They previously had their special rule where if they killed something in combat, you got a 5+ feel no pain type save. I did think that was maybe a bit on the weak side really. They might occasionally do that against some light infantry, though not consistently, and even then when they did trigger the 5+ feel no pain, it didn't exactly make them super durable given the rest of their stat line. Now though, they've traded that out for Fieldcraft, basically the sticky objectives type rule where if you have this under your control in the command phase, it remains yours until the opponent can actually take it. That's genuinely a handy rule to have in most armies. Several other factions like to have at least one unit that can do that in their army to mark their home objectives and then move out towards the midfield. Can just be kind of nice if your squad gets shot off it or fails battle shock or something. Overall, definitely a little bit more helpful with them fighting and taking objectives. Finally, for the actual hunting pack box set units, there's the mighty Krootox. Mounted units that I'm really not too surprised has had a bit of a glow up on the stat lines. The new model does seem a bit bigger and chunkier than the old one. I was expecting it to be a bit more durable in some way. It seems that the model is still fairly chunky in terms of its stats, but still more going to be a sort of bully unit against Space Marines as opposed to really tough stuff. It's increased to toughness 6 from toughness 5. It's 5 wounds where it was previously 4, and its save is confirmed to be at least not better than the 5 plus save, given that it was taking 5 plus invulnerable saves. Previously it was a 6 plus, and I wouldn't be too surprised if it remained as such. The big repeater cannon gun is a little bit more threatening than the previous Kroot gun. It gets you 2 shots at ballistic skill 4 plus, strength 7, AP 1 and damage 2. My guess would be it's probably out to the 36-inch range that the previous issue Kroot gun had. But unlike that previous issue Kroot gun, it gets rapid fire 2 when it's within half range, and also AP -1 where the old Kroot gun had 0. It is just a tiny bit more threatening, though it's still certainly not going to be something that vehicles care too much about. It doesn't really look like it's actually going to be a particularly threatening range damage dealer with those kind of stats. The other option is going to be the Tangle Cannon, which we don't know the stats for, though based on the Kroot Carnivore squad, it looks like it's likely going to be a blast anti-infantry sort of weapon, which isn't really what the Kroot need in support. I think it would need to be an enormously efficient anti-infantry gun for people to consider that over something with multi-damage and AP. In melee, it looks like it's unchanged and the same as before. 4 attacks at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2, hitting on a 3+. Okay at punching a couple of lighter infantry or space marines to death. It looks like this is the same profile as those younger Krootox Rampagers, but just doesn't get the sustained hits. Finally, we didn't actually see this one in action, though it does sound like their Kroot Packmate special rule has actually been changed a bit to a sort of return fire kind of mechanic. The description at the start of the video said that if you shoot my friends, they'll shoot you back, so it sounds like this guy might have a special rule in a similar sort of vein to the Invader ATV and similar. Basically, if you hit a Kroot unit nearby, this guy might just be able to shoot you back in the face. If so, I guess that would be okay, given its gun has got okay range and is at least a little bit general purpose. Most likely going to be a bit of extra chip damage as opposed to do anything too meaningful, unless it gets incredibly lucky though. Otherwise, if that's not the case and it's just the same, it'd be a +1 to hit if it's nearby Kroot Carnivores, which I guess wouldn't be too bad either. Otherwise, we've already had a fair few rules previews for the other models. The Trail Shaper wasn't present in this one as he's not in the Kroot hunting pack, though I think that his rules were quite good. He allows you to redeploy a whole bunch of Kroot units after you know first turn, and combined with scout moves, that could mean that you get a few units really quite well deployed to counter the enemy. And then for his lead squad, he gets to do a reactive move when enemies move within 9 inches, they get to move d6. That's always quite a tricky one and can mean that his squad could hide on objectives and things or reposition themselves to avoid fire. The Lone Spear is the Chameleonic Rider. I'm pretty certain it'll have Lone Operative given it's got Chameleonic and the word Lone in its title. He rides a cavalry, which would usually mean that it's going to be a 10-inch move unless it's an unusually slow cavalry miniature. And this one could also provide a damage boost to Kroot armies. If you hit something with a ranged attack, then the rest of your Kroot models gets to re-roll the hit roll against that same target. That applies in both range and melee, and it means that you could potentially both be having a +1 to hit and also re-roll the hit roll for Kroot units. They could definitely land a whole load of hits. If the Flesh Shaper winds up getting lethal hits, that could actually stack a surprising amount of AP 0 damage. Otherwise, we've confirmed that he gets a sniper shot at strength 6, AP 2, damage 3 with heavy and precision, which is a bit unreliable for actually destroying characters, but kind of fun. Explosive tipped javelins as his alternative loadout that we don't know the profile for, and just in general I feel like he could be interesting enough. Any cheap lone operative that's fairly fast and has some buffing rules is likely to be in a fairly good place. They're just handy disruptive things to have around that the units can't really get to grips with too easily. Finally, last but not least, are the Kroot Doggos. Kroot Hounds I think are interesting enough to have in a Tau army at the moment. They're very cheap, they can scout, and they're just good for nuisance secondary and screening units. Given their new kit on the way, it seems likely that you'll buy them in squads of 5 now rather than squads of 4, which I guess means that they might not be quite as efficient for super cheap nuisances. The rules that we had previewed for them were that while they're objective control 0 normally, they will go to objective control 1 if they're within 12 inches of a character, which is kind of fun. If they're only ranging a little bit ahead of the battle line, then that means they could actually take primary points, which does help. And if they start their turn within 6 inches of a Kroot infantry squad, then they get to advance and charge. With the scout moves, it means that these guys could be hurtling straight into the enemy deployment zone turn 1 and basically just tie up their units. They probably wouldn't be dealing all that much damage with their jaws and things, but to be honest, they don't really have to have immense value there. if you block a couple of key units from moving up the board for a turn, or maybe tie up some infantry so they can't shoot, that might be all the value that you need out of them. Again, I certainly hope that they'd be really quite cheap given very little damage and defense, but those rules look like they could be in a fairly good place. Overall, I feel like there's really quite a lot to like out of those previews. I'm not sure it's enormously great news for making Kroot viable as their own faction. It just seems that if you're, say, running up against an army of Imperial Knights, you're going to have a lot of units that just aren't really going to be able to do much meaningful damage to any tough targets, even with using all their sneaky tricks and stacking damage buffs. I guess it's not impossible we might have some anti-vehicle style stratagems in the rest of the detachment, which I think would have been a good move if they are trying to make them viable as their own force. I guess we'll have to wait and see for the rest of the rules. Just for their own units though, I feel like most of them are looking really quite interesting and fun. If you can mix and match some Tau units into that detachment, you could have some big scary mech suits with some heavy firepower to take down the enemy's tough things, and leave the Kroots to take the objectives and score all the points. I feel like the Krootox Rampagers will be really quite a fun unit to use. Very destructive looking melee there. The Hounds, Carnivores and Lone Spear all look interesting for being nuisance skirmish and screening units. I feel like the ones that might be most points dependent are the Krootox Rider, who I think would have to be a super cheap nuisance unit to really justify himself, and also the Kroot characters. I feel like it's often just not a particularly sensible idea to invest more points in screening sort of skirmish units like the Kroot Carnivores, unless they very directly help out with exactly that role. Again, I feel like most of those characters would probably have to be very cheap in points to really make people super tempted to play them in some kind of optimal list. In any case, I guess we can't make too many judgments without points cost yet. It could be very high, could be very low. I'll be interested to hear what you think down in the comments below. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this in any case. I'll certainly cover any more previews that we get for the Kroot and the Tau. I'm certainly looking forward to doing a full review of the Tau Codex as soon as it comes out. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see a similar sort of video to this. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to check it out. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos earlier, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.